On the morning of January 28, 1547, a 9-year-old girl woke to the tolling of bells. Her father, King Henry VIII, was dead. The man who had torn a kingdom apart in search of a son left behind only daughters, and among them the least expected to survive was Elizabeth. She was the child of Anne Boleyn, the queen executed by Henry's order when Elizabeth was not yet 3. By all rights, this girl should have been forgotten, discarded as her mother had been. And yet, she would become the longest reigning Tudor monarch. She would be courted by kings, pressured by councils, and watched by enemies who measured her worth by one question: when will she marry? But Elizabeth never did. For 45 years she ruled alone. No husband, no children, no heir of her body. Why? The explanations range from politics to religion, from psychology to physiology. Today we examine the evidence, without myth or invention. Was Elizabeth's refusal a deliberate strategy, a trauma-born resistance, or something more hidden? Stay with us, because the answer is not what most believe, and it reshaped the destiny of England. Elizabeth's birth in September 1533 was not celebrated across Europe. Henry VIII had risked excommunication to Mary Anne Boleyn, breaking from Rome to secure a legitimate son. When Anne produced a daughter instead, disappointment turned quickly to resentment. By 1536, Anne was executed on charges of adultery and treason, widely considered fabricated. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. Yet survival itself became her advantage. Where other Tudor children died young, Henry Fitzroy, Edward VI, and Mary's phantom pregnancies, Elizabeth lived. She was reinserted into the succession by the Third Succession Act of 1543, though her legitimacy remained in question. Under guardianship after her mother's death, Elizabeth received an education rivaling any prince's. She studied classical languages, history, theology, and rhetoric. Roger Ascham, her tutor, praised her intellect and discipline. Unlike her half-sister Mary, whose reign was deeply tied to Catholic orthodoxy, Elizabeth absorbed Protestant thought but maintained pragmatism. Her education cultivated independence. Early letters reveal a young woman keenly aware of her precarious position. She understood that marriage, while expected, could also be fatal. The fate of her mother, and the volatile marriages of her father, were living reminders. The accession of Edward VI in 1547 shifted Elizabeth's position. As a Protestant prince, he offered some security, but his early death in 1553 reopened the succession question. The Duke of Northumberland attempted to install Lady Jane Grey, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth. When Mary Tudor successfully seized the throne, Elizabeth's future was again in danger. Mary, a devout Catholic, suspected Elizabeth of Protestant sympathies and potential conspiracy. The Wyatt Rebellion of 1554 nearly cost Elizabeth her life. Imprisoned in the Tower, she wrote a letter to Mary affirming her innocence, declaring, "I am no traitor." It worked, barely. Elizabeth was released but kept under house arrest. These formative experiences taught her caution. Marriage could entangle her in factional politics or foreign alliances, placing her life at risk. When Mary I died childless in November 1558, Elizabeth became queen at 25. Her coronation speech emphasized unity, presenting herself as God's chosen sovereign despite lingering doubts about her legitimacy. Immediately, the question arose: whom would she marry? Her counselors urged union to secure the succession. European monarchs proposed matches: Philip II of Spain, Archduke Charles of Austria, and later the Valois princes of France. Within England, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was a favorite but politically divisive. Marriage was not a private matter. It was the central question of diplomacy and succession. An English queen regnant was still an anomaly. Only Mary Tudor had reigned before, and her marriage to Philip II had proven disastrous, unpopular at home, politically constraining, and yielding no children. Elizabeth had witnessed this failure firsthand. From the outset, Elizabeth cultivated an image that transcended traditional gender roles. She declared in 1559, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." This rhetoric was not merely symbolic. It positioned her refusal to marry as devotion to her realm. Yet it also masked the political necessity. Remaining unmarried allowed Elizabeth to retain full sovereignty. Marriage would mean sharing, or surrendering, power. Over time, this persona hardened into the mythology of the Virgin Queen. Portraiture emphasized purity, pale skin, youthful features, elaborate gowns coated with symbols of chastity and divine authority. Her body became a political stage, projecting stability in a kingdom still reeling from religious division. Elizabeth's reign opened during an unsettled era. England was caught between Catholic and Protestant camps. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 established a moderate Protestant church, but Catholic Europe remained hostile. Marriage, therefore, carried geopolitical consequences. Aligning with France risked alienating Spain, aligning with Spain risked entanglement in continental wars. Internally, nobles jockeyed for influence. Each suitor represented a faction. To marry one risked alienating others, potentially destabilizing the crown. By keeping her options open, but never committing, Elizabeth maintained balance. Ambassadors complained of her delays and equivocations, yet this indecision was strategic. Still, anxiety mounted over succession. Without children, the Tudor line would end. Parliament petitioned Elizabeth repeatedly in the 1560s and 1570s to marry and secure heirs. She responded with eloquent but evasive speeches, promising care for her people while withholding commitment. The possibility of Mary, Queen of Scots, inheriting the English crown heightened the stakes. Catholic powers viewed Mary as legitimate, Protestants feared her accession would reverse the Reformation. Elizabeth's refusal to marry, and thus produce a Protestant heir, seemed perilous. Amid these pressures, Elizabeth's personal experiences weighed heavily. She had seen her mother executed, her stepmothers discarded or beheaded, her sister derided for infertility. The Tudor marriage record was one of blood and failure. Her own reputation was vulnerable. Rumors swirled around her relationship with Robert Dudley. His wife's suspicious death in 1560 made any union with him politically impossible. Suitors from abroad carried risks of foreign domination. By the 1580s, Elizabeth was in her 50s. Marriage and childbirth, at that age, were unlikely. The Virgin Queen persona became not only a political tool but a necessity. She was now wed to her role alone. Yet beneath the politics, religion, and psychology lies the unresolved question: was there another reason Elizabeth refused to marry? Foreign envoys noted her unusual appearance at times, tall stature, commanding voice, physical mannerisms considered masculine for the period. Court physicians were said to treat her with exceptional privacy, never examining her fully. Later reports, some credible, others speculative, suggested Elizabeth may have had physical conditions that made marriage difficult or undesirable. Whether or not these claims hold, the secrecy itself is revealing. Elizabeth went to great lengths to guard her body from scrutiny, even removing mirrors from her chambers in later years. Thus, by the end of the 16th century, Elizabeth had transformed her refusal into a cornerstone of national identity. But what began as political calculation became something deeper, a mystery that her closest counselors whispered about and foreign ambassadors tried to decode. Elizabeth had declared herself married to England, but her council knew that answer was not enough. By the 1570s, pressure mounted, and whispers spread that the truth of her refusal lay not in politics alone, but in her very body. Elizabeth's reign was not hers alone to steer. From the moment she inherited the crown in 1558, the Privy Council pressed the urgency of marriage. William Cecil, her most trusted adviser, made it clear, without a husband and heir, the Tudor dynasty was destined to collapse. Cecil's memoranda to the Queen framed the succession crisis as not just a family issue but a national one. England, he argued, risked invasion and civil war if her body failed to produce continuity. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, represented the opposite pole of counsel. Where Cecil argued for dynastic security, Dudley embodied the romantic and personal temptation. He was Elizabeth's childhood companion, a fellow prisoner during the reign of Mary Tudor, and the man most often whispered about in connection to the Queen's private life. The affection between them was obvious to observers, but his wife's suspicious death in 1560 destroyed the possibility of legitimate union. For Elizabeth, Dudley's presence served both as comfort and as a useful distraction, a way of keeping foreign suitors at bay without closing the door to diplomacy. Philip II of Spain, widower of Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, made the earliest formal proposal. Politically, the union would have cemented Anglo-Spanish ties and checked France. But Elizabeth's council and populace recoiled at the thought. Mary's unpopular marriage to Philip had bred resentment. Englishmen feared subordination to Spanish interests. Archduke Charles of Austria, a Habsburg, was another serious candidate. Negotiations dragged across the 1560s. Yet Elizabeth's delays frustrated the Austrian court. Venetian envoys noted her skill in keeping men in hope without granting them satisfaction. To Charles, her equivocation became an embarrassment. To Elizabeth, it was deliberate, a way to keep Austria friendly without binding herself. From France came the Valois princes, Henri, Duke of Anjou, and later François, Duke of Alençon. Anjou's courtship, though politically promising, ran aground on religious grounds. He was Catholic, and rumors of his private conduct scandalized Protestant courtiers. Elizabeth entertained the idea of marrying Alençon in the 1570s and 1580s, even calling him "my little frog." Yet age, religion, and national suspicion ultimately doomed the match. Each proposal reveals Elizabeth's strategy. She used suitors as pawns in the great game of European diplomacy. Promises of marriage opened doors, delays kept allies hopeful, rejection was always deferred, rarely explicit. In this way, she leveraged her unmarried state into an instrument of power. Beyond councillors and princes, there was Parliament and the public. The House of Commons repeatedly petitioned Elizabeth to marry, particularly in the early 1560s. A famous petition of 1563 begged her to provide for the succession, lest England fall into chaos. Elizabeth replied with practiced eloquence, thanking Parliament for its concern but refusing commitment. Public opinion was more complex. Many Englishmen admired her independence. Sermons praised her chastity, equating it with national purity. Others feared instability. Broadsheets and pamphlets speculated about her health, her capacity for childbirth, and whispered scandals with Dudley. This public discourse added pressure, but Elizabeth's refusal to yield strengthened her mystique. The queen who defied expectation became an object of fascination and loyalty. The single most dangerous figure in Elizabeth's marital politics was Mary Stuart. To Catholics across Europe, Mary was the rightful Queen of England. Her marriage alliances, first with the French Dauphin, then with Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, produced heirs with Tudor blood. Elizabeth's refusal to marry and bear children made Mary an ever-present threat. The Ridolfi Plot, 1571, Throckmorton Plot, 1583, and Babington Plot, 1586, all aimed to replace Elizabeth with Mary, usually via Spanish intervention. Each conspiracy sharpened the stakes. Elizabeth's body was not just her own, but the frontier of Protestant England. To marry a Catholic would be treason to her settlement. To remain unmarried was dangerous but, paradoxically, safer than binding herself to foreign Catholic powers. Behind these political calculations lay Elizabeth's private experiences. She had witnessed her father execute 2 wives and discard others. She had seen her sister Mary mocked for infertility and condemned for marrying a foreign king. Even in her own youth, she had endured scandal. At 14, while under the guardianship of Thomas Seymour, she was subjected to inappropriate advances that nearly destroyed her reputation. This episode, investigated by the Privy Council, left lasting marks. Some historians argue that her deep caution toward intimacy and marriage stemmed in part from this trauma. Thus, when her council pressed marriage, Elizabeth had personal reasons for caution. Marriage meant surrendering autonomy to a man who could discard, dominate, or destroy her. She had learned that lesson early, and she would not forget it. As Elizabeth aged, the tone of her council's advice shifted. By the 1580s, the hope of children was fading. Cecil, now Lord Burleigh, and his successor, Robert Cecil, redirected their focus to managing succession without Elizabeth's offspring. James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart, emerged as the most viable heir. Elizabeth's refusal to marry, once seen as reckless, came to be understood as permanent. Her courtiers stopped pressing with urgency. Instead, they worked around the silence, preparing for a transition she would never acknowledge openly. Ambassadors across Europe chronicled her decisions with fascination and frustration. The Spanish envoy de Quadra wrote in 1560 that Elizabeth means never to marry, and yet she gives out the contrary in order to keep her suitors in hand. The French ambassador Paul de Foix described her as elusive, noting her ability to answer always with words so sweet that they promise all, yet bind to nothing. These reports, preserved in diplomatic archives, confirm that Elizabeth's marriage policy was deliberate, not indecisive. Her very refusal became a strategy, the art of ruling through ambiguity. By the late 1580s, one thing was certain: Elizabeth would not marry. But if politics and trauma explain much, they may not explain everything. Ambassadors noted peculiarities about her health and appearance. Physicians' notes hinted at hidden conditions. Could the final reason lie not in politics, but in her body itself? To understand Elizabeth's refusal, we must place it within the broader political economy of 16th-century Europe. Royal marriages were never personal unions alone, they were treaties in human form. A queen consort brought dowries, alliances, and military commitments. A queen regnant, however, faced a different challenge. Her marriage could not merely extend alliances, it risked subordinating sovereignty. For Elizabeth, each suitor represented more than companionship. Philip II's proposal tied England to Spain's wars against France and the Netherlands. The Archduke Charles of Austria would have drawn England back into the Habsburg orbit. The French Valois brothers offered potential alliance, but with the baggage of Catholic power. In every case, marriage meant binding England's foreign policy to another crown. By refusing, Elizabeth preserved strategic flexibility. She could court France when counterbalancing Spain, then signal interest in Spain to restrain France. The act of remaining available but uncommitted became a tool of statecraft, a form of diplomatic currency. Religious identity lay at the heart of Elizabeth's decision-making. The 1559 Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity created a Protestant Church of England, but its legitimacy was fragile. Catholics rejected Elizabeth's authority, some Protestants pressed for more radical reform. A marriage to a Catholic would undermine the settlement, a marriage to a militant Protestant could provoke Catholic rebellion and foreign hostility. Remaining unmarried allowed Elizabeth to portray herself as the neutral guardian of religious stability. Her image as a chaste, consecrated ruler mirrored the Catholic cult of the Virgin Mary, yet it also served Protestant propaganda, presenting her as England's pure defender against Rome. This dual symbolism held the settlement together. At a deeper level, Elizabeth's situation was shaped by gender politics. In Tudor law and custom, wives were expected to obey husbands. A married queen risked ceding legal authority to her spouse. The precedent of Mary Tudor's marriage to Philip II illustrated the danger. Her unpopular consort wielded disproportionate influence, sparking resistance at home. Elizabeth learned from that example. By remaining unmarried, she retained the full rights of sovereignty. In speeches, she recast her single state as a virtue. She was both mother and father to her people. "I am your queen," she told Parliament, "and I shall never be by marriage subject to another." These declarations were not abstract, they were the legal bedrock of her independence. Economics also shaped the issue. Royal marriages were costly. Dowries, jointures, and the maintenance of foreign households drained the treasury. Elizabeth inherited a realm burdened by debts from her father's wars and her sister's policies. Careful with finances, she resisted entering an expensive marital alliance that could entangle England in continental conflicts. Instead, she invested in a policy of maritime expansion. By the 1570s and 1580s, English privateers such as Francis Drake struck Spanish shipping, bringing bullion into royal coffers. This shift from dowry diplomacy to naval enterprise was enabled by her independence. A foreign consort would have constrained these ventures. The greatest argument for marriage remained the succession. Without children, the Tudor line faced extinction. Parliament returned again and again to this point. The fear of civil war haunted memories of the 15th-century Wars of the Roses, when rival claims drenched England in blood. Yet Elizabeth managed the succession problem not through childbirth but through ambiguity. She refused to name an heir, fearing that doing so would invite plots against her life. The uncertainty forced potential claimants, from Mary, Queen of Scots, to James VI of Scotland, to tread carefully. Her very silence was a political weapon. As Ambassador de Silva remarked, she holds all in doubt, and in doubt she holds them in obedience. The international system magnified these dilemmas. Spain and France, the two Catholic superpowers, watched her decisions closely. Each feared England falling into the other's sphere of influence. By playing suitors off one another, Elizabeth secured breathing space. The 1572 Treaty of Blois, aligning England with France against Spain, was built on the possibility, never realized, of marriage to the Duke of Anjou. Even the threat of marriage could be mobilized as diplomacy. Elizabeth's court encouraged rumors of negotiations when advantageous, then quietly let them fade. For her, marriage was never about consummation but about leverage. Beyond policy, Elizabeth's celibacy became an economic engine of loyalty. Portraits, pageants, and sermons celebrated her virginity as the source of England's prosperity. The cult of Gloriana portrayed the Queen as eternal, youthful, and incorruptible. Artists depicted her with symbols of fertility, ripe fruit, flourishing gardens, while emphasizing her untouched body. This imagery reassured subjects that the Queen herself embodied continuity. Her person became a metaphor for the state's well-being. The economy of image reduced pressure for a biological heir by substituting a symbolic one, England itself. Marriage also threatened to inflame domestic factionalism. If Elizabeth chose an English noble, rival houses would resent the elevation of one family above others. If she chose a foreign prince, xenophobia and fears of domination would erupt. By staying single, she denied her nobles grounds for jealousy. Instead, she played favorites strategically, raising and lowering courtiers to prevent any single faction from dominating. Robert Dudley was both favored and checked. The Howard family, once close to the throne, was balanced against the Cecils. By never marrying, Elizabeth remained the axis around which politics revolved. It is important to recognize that Elizabeth's decision inverted expectations of womanhood. 16th-century culture defined women through marriage and motherhood. By rejecting both, she courted scandal. Yet she turned the scandal into authority. Poets praised her as Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice. Bishops compared her to Deborah, the biblical judge who ruled Israel. These cultural appropriations legitimized her single state. Elizabeth herself reinforced the mythology. In speeches, she reminded her people that she had chosen their welfare over personal comfort. In one address, she declared, "In the end, this shall be for me sufficient, that a marble stone shall declare that a queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin." What emerges from these socio-political and economic drivers is a pattern: ambiguity as power. Elizabeth refused to resolve the marriage question not because she could not, but because leaving it unresolved served her. Her body became a stage upon which the great dramas of European religion, economics, and diplomacy were played. Her singleness, once a vulnerability, became the most enduring strength of her reign. Yet the ambiguity cannot explain everything. Foreign envoys noticed troubling signs: the Queen's failing teeth, her heavy cosmetics, her aversion to close physical scrutiny. Could her refusal to marry also mask a hidden reality, one written not in politics, but in her flesh? By the middle decades of Elizabeth's reign, the marriage question reached a breaking point. She was entering her 30s, still of childbearing age, but the clock was ticking. Parliament petitioned her relentlessly, warning that failure to provide an heir endangered both crown and country. "Your people fear nothing more," one Commons petition declared in 1566, "than the misfortune of dying without issue." Elizabeth responded with controlled anger. In her speech of October 1566, she admonished the Commons for overstepping their bounds, insisting that marriage was a matter of royal prerogative. Yet even in rebuke, she reassured them with promises of care. This balancing act, chastising, yet comforting, became her hallmark. Behind the scenes, however, pressure was mounting. Her counselors knew that the Tudor bloodline was fragile. Factions debated whether to favor Robert Dudley, the Habsburg Archduke, or a French prince. Each option risked foreign entanglement or domestic division. Elizabeth's stalling strategy was beginning to strain. The turning point came with Mary Stuart's return to Scotland in 1561. Widowed from the French king, Mary was young, Catholic, and a legitimate granddaughter of Henry VII. To many Catholics, she was the rightful Queen of England. Her marriage to Lord Darnley in 1565 strengthened her claim, for Darnley too carried Tudor blood. For Elizabeth, this was a nightmare scenario. Her own refusal to marry and produce an heir contrasted sharply with Mary, who gave birth to James in 1566. Suddenly, the succession question was no longer abstract. A living child of Tudor descent existed north of the border. Plots and conspiracies multiplied. Catholic exiles in Europe rallied around Mary. Pope Pius V's excommunication of Elizabeth in 1570 gave further legitimacy to rebellion. The Northern Rebellion of 1569 and subsequent Catholic plots revealed how precarious Elizabeth's position had become. Her unmarried state fed fears that upon her death, England would fall to Catholic rule through Mary's son. In this climate of insecurity, Elizabeth entertained one of her most controversial courtships, François, Duke of Alençon. Despite their age difference and his Catholic faith, Elizabeth courted him seriously in the late 1570s and early 1580s. The proposed marriage promised French support against Spain and a potential check to Mary's influence. Public opinion, however, recoiled. Pamphlets denounced the match as betrayal. Parliament begged Elizabeth not to marry a Catholic foreigner. She toyed with the negotiations, addressing Alençon affectionately as "my little frog," yet never committed. By 1582, the prospect had collapsed. Alençon returned to France humiliated, while Elizabeth preserved her independence. The Alençon episode revealed both the power and the limits of her strategy. She had gained temporary leverage with France, but at the cost of domestic unease. Her people's resistance to a Catholic marriage underscored that her options were closing. By the 1580s, Elizabeth was in her 50s. The possibility of marriage producing children had virtually ended. At the same time, threats intensified. Spain, enraged by English privateering and support for Dutch rebels, prepared for conflict. Mary Stuart, captive in England since 1568, remained the focal point of Catholic hopes. The turning point came with the Babington Plot of 1586. Letters proved Mary's involvement in plans to assassinate Elizabeth and place herself on the throne. For years, Elizabeth had resisted executing her cousin. Now she faced no choice. Mary was tried, condemned, and executed in 1587. The act shocked Europe but secured Elizabeth's throne. Her decision to eliminate Mary was inextricably tied to her own refusal to marry. Had Elizabeth borne children, Mary's claim might have been irrelevant. Without an heir, however, Mary was the ever-present alternative. The execution marked a grim acknowledgement. Elizabeth's personal choice had magnified the stakes of succession to the point of bloodshed. The execution of Mary precipitated Spain's assault. In 1588, Philip II launched the Armada, the greatest naval force of the age. Elizabeth's unmarried state became part of her rallying image. At Tilbury, addressing troops in armor, she declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." This speech, widely circulated, crystallized her transformation. Marriage was no longer a question. She presented herself as both king and queen, embodying England's defiance. The Armada's defeat not only preserved her realm but sanctified her virgin image in national memory. Elizabeth had weathered crises, executed rivals, and seen off Spain's mightiest fleet. By the late 1580s, her independence was secure. Yet her physical decline was becoming harder to hide. Observers noted her blackened teeth, her layers of cosmetics, her refusal to be closely seen. Was the greatest secret of all not her politics, but the hidden condition of her own body? After the triumph of 1588, Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen stood at its peak. But the following decade revealed the cost of her long independence. Age and illness advanced, courtiers grew restless, and foreign observers recorded troubling details about her condition. By the 1590s, Elizabeth was well into her 60s. In an age when few women lived so long, her survival was remarkable, yet it magnified questions about why she had never married. With no prospect of children, speculation turned from diplomacy to her body itself. Contemporary descriptions emphasize her increasing dependence on cosmetics. Venetian envoys wrote of her painted face and wigs, noting that she avoided close encounters. Courtiers remarked on her blackened teeth, a classic sign of decay worsened by the sugar-heavy Tudor diet and perhaps by the lead-based cosmetics she used. Elizabeth withdrew mirrors from her chambers, according to chroniclers, unable to confront the changes age and treatments had wrought. She staged elaborate ceremonies of dressing and presentation, ensuring that only the image of eternal youth reached her subjects. But private notes from physicians suggest she suffered chronic ailments. Reports of swellings, ulcers, and digestive distress appear in the 1590s. While some of these may reflect ordinary aging, others hint at more unusual conditions. Elizabeth guarded her body with exceptional secrecy. Court physicians were rarely allowed to examine her fully. When illness struck in 1593, some observers remarked on her confusion and disorientation, possibly signs of neurological decline. The Privy Council managed appearances, sometimes employing carefully staged substitutes at public ceremonies. Such secrecy invited rumor. Ambassadors speculated that the Queen concealed physical deformities. Some accounts, written decades later, alleged abnormalities that explained her refusal to marry. While many of these claims remain unverified or exaggerated, their persistence reflects how deeply contemporaries linked her body to her politics. One of the most discussed reports comes from Richard Manningham, a physician who later described an ominous swelling near Elizabeth's breast in her final years. He recorded a mass, the size of a goose egg, with darkened veins, which when lanced released foul fluid. Historians debate whether this was cancer, an abscess, or another growth. What matters is not the diagnosis but the secrecy. Such a condition would have made marriage, intimacy, or childbirth perilous. If Elizabeth had been aware of bodily impediments from youth, it may have shaped her lifelong decision to avoid matrimony. Even in decline, pressure did not entirely abate. In the 1590s, some still raised the possibility of marriage, not for children, but for alliance. Yet Elizabeth rejected every approach. She had turned down kings, princes, and favorites for decades. By now the pattern was undeniable, the refusal was absolute. Her court adjusted. Instead of urging marriage, counselors shifted to preparing succession. Robert Cecil corresponded with James VI of Scotland, laying groundwork for a smooth transfer. The Virgin Queen persona had become irreversible fact. Elizabeth's final years were a theater of endurance. She stood for hours, refusing to lie down, fearing that rest would invite death. She fasted, unable to swallow without pain. Courtiers described her as skeletal beneath her gowns. In March 1603, she collapsed after a seizure. Witnesses described strange movements and labored breathing. Within days, she was dead. She had reigned for 45 years, the longest of any Tudor. And she had never married. Her funeral procession through London drew immense crowds. Yet even in death, secrecy surrounded her body. Accounts suggest she was quickly sealed in a lead coffin, without the usual public lying in state. No death mask was taken. Her physicians and attendants were sworn to silence. For contemporaries, the conclusion was clear: Elizabeth had chosen her country over marriage. For later generations, the mystery deepened. Did she refuse because of political strategy, personal trauma, or hidden physical impediment? Perhaps all three intertwined. The climax of Elizabeth's story is not one dramatic battle or marriage contract, but the cumulative weight of refusal. She had turned down every alliance, endured every petition, and faced down every conspiracy without yielding her sovereignty. At Tilbury she had declared she possessed the heart and stomach of a king. By the end, she had proven it. She ruled as sole sovereign, without husband or heir, and remade monarchy itself. Her death marked the end of the Tudor line, but her legacy was secured. She had redefined queenship as independence, transforming what seemed a liability, her singleness, into the symbol of an age. Elizabeth's triumph was complete, but her body remained the greatest secret of her reign. As her coffin was lowered into Westminster Abbey, questions lingered. What truths lay sealed with her? And why has no monarch's tomb since been guarded with such determined silence? When Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended with her. No marriage, no children, no heir of her body. The vacuum was filled by James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. The succession was smoother than many had feared, but the fact remains: Elizabeth's lifelong refusal had extinguished her family's direct line. This transition shaped the entire future of Britain. By uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under James, Elizabeth's death paved the way for the Stuart dynasty and, eventually, the creation of Great Britain. What had seemed a reckless gamble, ruling unmarried, proved workable, though it came at the cost of Tudor continuity. Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir during her lifetime frustrated her counselors, but in retrospect it had a stabilizing effect. Any clear declaration would have made her a target for conspiracies. By maintaining silence, she ensured potential successors like James VI behaved cautiously. His eventual accession was not the product of Elizabeth's blessing, but of her careful management of ambiguity. Yet this strategy carried long shadows. Without a child of her own, Elizabeth left England vulnerable to dynastic shifts beyond its borders. Foreign powers watched closely, hoping to influence succession. That England avoided civil war owed much to Cecil's behind-the-scenes negotiation, not to any succession plan Elizabeth left behind. The immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's death was the deliberate construction of memory. Sermons, poems, and engravings praised her chastity, her wisdom, and her image as the Virgin Queen. Funerary pageants depicted her as Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice, returning to the heavens. Her singleness, once controversial, was now celebrated as providential. This was political necessity. The Stuart dynasty needed to legitimize its inheritance, but it also needed to honor Elizabeth to placate her loyal subjects. By turning her refusal to marry into a symbol of national purity, England transformed potential weakness into cultural strength. The narrative of Gloriana, immortal and incorruptible, eclipsed the human frailties hidden during her final years. Abroad, Elizabeth's death closed a chapter in European politics. Spain, though still hostile, recognized that its great adversary had passed. France, once a suitor through its princes, recalibrated its diplomacy with James. Ambassadors who had long puzzled over Elizabeth's marital status now spoke of her political brilliance. Even critics conceded that her independence had preserved England through decades of turmoil. Yet whispers lingered. Catholic polemicists repeated rumors that she was incapable of marriage due to physical impediments. These claims, often unverified, reinforced the Catholic portrayal of her as illegitimate or cursed. Though politically motivated, they show how central her body remained to perceptions of her reign. Domestically, Elizabeth's reign without marriage reshaped expectations of queenship. She proved that a woman could govern as sole sovereign for nearly half a century. Her independence coincided with relative internal stability, growth in commerce, and the beginnings of overseas expansion. Economically, her avoidance of costly foreign marriages preserved resources. Instead of pouring wealth into dowries and continental wars, she invested in naval defense and supported private ventures like those of Drake and Raleigh. These choices laid foundations for England's rise as a maritime power. However, the lack of a direct heir left uncertainty. The Stuart accession brought new policies and conflicts, including struggles over religion and parliamentary authority that Elizabeth had managed through personal rule. Her singular strategy could not be replicated easily. Behind the triumphs lay human costs. Elizabeth's cousin Mary Stuart was executed, in part because Elizabeth's singleness magnified succession rivalry. Courtiers spent decades maneuvering fruitlessly for royal favor through proposed marriages. Whole generations of subjects lived with uncertainty about who would rule next. Even Elizabeth herself paid a price. Her final years were marked by loneliness and physical suffering, endured in the service of a political identity she could not relinquish. In becoming the Virgin Queen, she sacrificed the ordinary comforts of marriage and family. One striking consequence of her death was the extreme secrecy surrounding her remains. Unlike earlier monarchs, Elizabeth was not displayed publicly for long. No official death mask was taken. Her body was quickly sealed in lead and buried in Westminster Abbey. This secrecy has fueled centuries of speculation. Was it simply a precaution against disease, or a deliberate effort to conceal the toll of age and cosmetics? Without examination, the truth remains locked in her tomb. The silence itself became part of her legacy. Over time, Elizabeth's refusal was reinterpreted not as a failure but as her crowning achievement. The cult of Gloriana shaped plays, poetry, and political discourse. Writers like Edmund Spenser and later historians framed her singleness as divine choice, elevating her above ordinary human passions. Yet beneath the myth lay a harsher reality: her refusal left England without a Tudor future. The transition to the Stuarts brought peace, but also new tensions that would erupt in civil war within decades. Elizabeth's personal choice had altered the trajectory of a kingdom. Elizabeth's death closed the Tudor story but opened new questions. Was her refusal truly strategic genius, or a necessity imposed by hidden truths of her body? As her coffin rests sealed in Westminster Abbey, the answer remains entombed with her, a silence that has lasted more than 4 centuries. Elizabeth's refusal to marry redefined what it meant to be a female ruler in early modern Europe. In an age when dynastic marriage was the cornerstone of diplomacy, she demonstrated that a woman could hold authority not by yielding to a husband, but by embodying sovereignty herself. Her reign challenged assumptions about gender, power, and legitimacy. The lesson here is stark: leadership is not always about conforming to expectations. Sometimes it is about reshaping the very rules that others take for granted. Elizabeth showed that even in a patriarchal society, independence could be turned from liability into weapon. Her legacy also reveals the paradox of personal sacrifice in politics. Elizabeth may have enjoyed admiration, but she also endured loneliness, secrecy, and relentless speculation about her body and choices. By refusing marriage, she preserved her authority but denied herself the traditional roles of wife and mother. This tension raises a timeless question: how much must leaders sacrifice of their private lives to preserve their public ones? Elizabeth's life reminds us that every act of independence carries its own cost. Elizabeth mastered the politics of image. She turned her unmarried state into a symbol of divine favor, commissioning portraits that portrayed her as eternal, youthful, and victorious. This manipulation of symbolism helped sustain national unity during times of crisis. In modern terms, her reign foreshadowed the importance of public relations. The ability to control narrative, to project strength while concealing vulnerability, remains central to leadership today. Elizabeth's painted face and carefully staged appearances were the 16th-century equivalent of statecraft through media. Another enduring lesson lies in her use of ambiguity. Elizabeth rarely closed options. She entertained suitors without committing, hinted at succession without naming an heir, and balanced between religious factions without fully siding with either extreme. This deliberate uncertainty was frustrating to her counselors, but it gave her leverage. In today's political environment, where leaders are often pressed for absolute positions, her example illustrates the value of keeping rivals off balance. Ambiguity, when controlled, can be a source of strength. Elizabeth's story continues to fascinate because it speaks to universal themes: the burden of leadership, the tension between private life and public duty, and the challenge of asserting authority in a world structured against you. Her independence has been reinterpreted in each generation. To Victorians, she was the virtuous Virgin Queen, embodying national pride. To 20th-century feminists, she symbolized a woman's capacity to rule without dependence on men. To 21st-century audiences, her life offers lessons about power, identity, and the politics of self-presentation. Her reign endures as a reminder that history's greatest figures are often those who refuse to conform. Yet her story also carries a warning. Elizabeth's greatest secret, her body and the reasons she never married, remains unsolved. This silence reminds us of the limits of history. Even the most powerful rulers leave mysteries beyond the reach of evidence. For modern audiences, this is not a frustration but an invitation. It is a reminder that history is not just about answers, but about enduring questions. Elizabeth's life compels us to look closely at power, gender, and secrecy, and to reflect on how those forces shape our world today. Elizabeth I never married. That single fact altered dynasties, redirected the fate of nations, and created one of the most enduring myths in history. Whether her refusal was strategy, necessity, or both, it transformed monarchy and continues to shape our imagination of leadership. She proved that sovereignty could be personal, indivisible, and absolute. And for that, she remains unforgettable. Her reign ended 4 centuries ago, yet the question still lingers: did Elizabeth choose never to marry, or was she forced by circumstance? Until her tomb is opened, history will leave us only with the silence she left behind. Elizabeth's refusal to marry was not just a personal choice, it was a historical pivot. It reshaped monarchy, redirected dynastic lines, and altered the balance of power in Europe. By standing alone, she showed that sovereignty could be embodied entirely in one figure, without husband, without heir. The consequences were vast: the end of the Tudors, the rise of the Stuarts, the shaping of Britain as a maritime power, and the enduring cultural myth of the Virgin Queen. Her life forces us to ask, is power strengthened by alliances, or by independence? Elizabeth's reign suggests that sometimes isolation is the most formidable strategy of all. Elizabeth's story resonates today because it reflects enduring dilemmas of leadership. Every leader faces the tension between public duty and private life. Every state faces the choice between entangling alliances and guarded independence. Every nation must ask how far image can be weaponized as policy. Elizabeth's mastery of ambiguity, her control of personal image, and her refusal to yield to convention prefigured the politics of modern identity. She showed that leadership is as much about perception as it is about action. In this way, her reign stands not only as a Tudor triumph but as a lesson for every age that followed. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey is sealed. The truth of her body may never be known. Yet the truth of her reign is written across centuries of history. She did not marry, but she did not need to. Her independence became her dynasty. This is the paradox at the heart of Elizabeth's story. What looked like absence, the absence of husband, the absence of heir, became presence. Her singleness became the single most defining force of an era. The Virgin Queen may have died childless, but she gave birth to an age, a myth, and a model of leadership that endures to this day. If you've stayed with us this far, you see how a single decision shaped the fate of kingdoms. What do you think Elizabeth's true reason was? Strategy, secrecy, or necessity? Share your thoughts below. And if you value deep, evidence-first history told like this, remember to subscribe and join us for more. 400 years later, Elizabeth still refuses us closure. She left no heir, no confession, and no explanation, only questions, myths, and a silence guarded by stone. Perhaps that is why she remains unforgettable, because the mystery itself keeps her alive. Thank you for watching Tale of History. If you found this story gripping, support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others who love history that refuses to be forgotten. Until next time, remember, the past is never silent, it waits for us to listen.